World War I. Four years of bitter conflict. Known as the Great War, or the war to end all wars. It's grim trench warfare, with Europe the main theater of war. But this was a war fought on many fronts. So there's another story, rarely told, of huge importance during the war and of lasting significance. A story of troops who fought and died, but who are often forgotten. And of an outcome that shaped the Middle East of today. This is World War I through Arab eyes. Malik Tariki, the Tunisian writer and broadcaster, takes us on a personal journey. His grandfather's generation fought in the war. Now Malik goes in search of what happened to these men, who they were, and why their stories often died with them. In this episode, he tells the story of how thousands of Arabs were conscripted by the British and French in North Africa. Their treatment and mistreatment. How Muslim was forced to fight against Muslim. And of the vital role Arabs played at Gallipoli. In episode 2, the Ottoman side of the story, the Young Turks rise to power. Their alliance with Germany. Their tyranny in the Levant. And the seeds of Arab revolt. And in episode 3, how the First World War ended 4 centuries of Ottoman rule, but drew the lines in the sand that would shape the Middle East for the next 100 years. In the second week of November 1914, the Ottoman Empire officially announced it was joining Germany and its allies in the war. The Grand Mufti in Istanbul also called on Muslims around the world to join a jihad, a struggle against Britain, Russia, and France. So Arabs were forced to fight on both sides for the Triple Entente European powers and for the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. The Grand Mufti's call and Ottoman entry into the war set Muslims against each other and created a complex tension that ran throughout the war. To compete with the enemy, the British and French needed to draft in large numbers of troops from across their respective empires. Britain recruited over 1 million troops in Egypt in different roles across the 4 years of the war. And France conscripted over 170,000 men from Algeria and a further 80,000 from Tunisia. The French invasion of Morocco in 1911 had installed General Hubert Lyautey as colonial governor. At the start of the war, he prepared to ship thousands of men to Europe from Moroccan ports, including Conétran.
The French occupation was hardly 2 years old when the war started, but the French managed to recruit tens of thousands of Moroccans and send them to the front from ports like this in Conétran, which was built by General Lyautey. "45,000 Moroccan soldiers embarked here and elsewhere. 1 in 4 never came back."
Malik went in search of how these heavy losses compared with European casualties.
الخسائر كانت دائما مرتفعة جدا في صفوف الجنود المغاربة، لأنه في نظر القيادة العامة الفرنسية والضباط الفرنسيون لاحظوا على أن الجندي المغربي يمتاز بشجاعة وببسالة فائقة، فدفعوا بهم إلى الجبهات الأمامية، وبالتالي كانت الخسائر في صفوفهم مرتفعة جدا. من بين 45,000 الذين شاركوا في الحرب قتل حوالي 12,000 مغربي دون احتساب المفقودين الجرحى والأسرى، ما يمثل نسبة 26.6%، وهي نسبة تفوق نسبة الفرنسيين التي قدرت ب 24%، والمغاربيين 15.1%.
Comparing death tolls can be difficult in a war with only partial written records. Historian Faisal Sharif thinks Tunisians were pitched into the front line to protect French troops.
حس التونسيون بصورة عامة أنهم سيكونون وقود هذه الحرب. هذا لا يتحدث عنه الكثير إلا بعض المؤرخين الفرنسيين الشجعان الذين تحدثوا عن هذا الأمر. هناك بعض الكتابات حول هذا الموضوع، أي حتى داخل الجبهات كيف كان يصطف الجنود، من يلقى بهم في الأول، من الذي يستكشف الجبهات في مرمى النيران. وسنعلم بعد أن الفيلق الرابع والفيلق الثامن كانوا هم أول من يدخل أو يحاول خرق الجبهات من الجبهات. ثم يتكلمون فيما بعد بالطبع عن شجاعة هذا الفيلق، ولكن نرى أن في هجوم واحد مثلا يمكن أن يفقدوا نصف العدد، يعني من 2000 جندي تقريبا يمكن أن يموت 1200 جندي.
وهذا وقع
فعلا. يعني هناك بعض المعارك مات فيها أكثر من 1200 جندي لخرق خط دفاعي ألماني بطول كيلومترين فقط. بالتالي هذا هو كان فرنسا أرادت أن تقي أبنائها يعني أهوال الحرب أو الموت بالدفع بهؤلاء المجندين من المستعمرات لكي يكونون هم الخارقون لجبهات القتال.
Not all historians share Sharif's view. Most agree there were differences in the way colonial troops were treated compared with Europeans, but facts about the war can be hard to pin down. French historian Gilbert Meunier believes figures vary from trench warfare to hand combat.
J'ai fait l'étude d'après les statistiques, avec, je sais pas, j'ai interviewé plus d'une centaine de tirailleurs algériens. D'après mes calculs, la mortalité était pratiquement la même entre les Algériens, Tunisiens, Marocains et Français. La seule différence, c'est que on s'était rendu compte que les Algériens résistaient très mal à ce qu'on appelle la guerre des tranchées, à rester pendant des semaines dans une tranchée. Alors souvent, on les menait à l'assaut. Pendant 3 jours, 4 jours, ils se battaient à l'assaut et on les retirait derrière, qu'ils soient tranquilles. Donc je pense que la surmortalité, elle a été vraie, mais au moment des assauts, au moment des combats. En revanche, je pense que les Algériens sont très peu morts dans les tranchées, comme ça a été le cas de beaucoup de Français.
Sometimes, oral rather than written history can shed light on these questions. The father of Tunisian writer Jalloul Azouna was conscripted into the French army. he left Jalloul in no doubt whatsoever as to how he was treated by some French officers.
كانوا معناها بصفة عامة موجودين معاهم جنود وضباط من فرنسا، وكان يقول لي الضباط الفرنساويين وبالخصوص اللي جايين من باريس كانوا عندهم ثقافة كبيرة وتربية كبيرة واحترام، لكن يقول لي فما ضباط أخرين بالطبع من أوساط شعبية ما هوش باهيين معانا، وكانوا دائما بصفة عامة الشمال الافريقي والتونسي والجزائر والمغرب حطوهم في الصف الاول، ودائما عددهم اكثر من عدد الفرنساويين.
هذه ثابته.
هذه ثابته.
هذه سياسه رسميه في
هذا هو انطباع والدي. انطباع والدي.
لان هنالك روايات متطابقه، كثير من الروايات تقول نفس الشيء.
هذه روايه والدي يقول لي احنا حاطين معناها يسميهم شيرا كانون،
حشو المدافع. حشو
المدافع بابدان التونسيين والمغاربه.
Azuna's father spoke of discrimination, and this is part of a bigger question of army discipline in the war. Deserters faced execution. But the French are accused of something more sinister, the ancient Roman army practice of decimation, the killing of every 10th member of a unit for failures of discipline. France is reported to have used it against its North African troops. As in Roman times, decimation was used against a whole unit rather than individuals. Malik investigated an incident here in the Belgian village of Zillebeck, near the battlefield of Ypres, on the 15th of December, 1914.
The word lash or coward strapped to their chests 20 Algerian and Tunisian soldiers from the 8th Company of the 10th Battalion of the Régiment Mixte de Tirailleurs Algériens were ordered to march unarmed towards the German lines. Their comrades ordered to shoot them if the enemy didn't.
It's not clear how widespread decimation was. For Gilbert Meunier, this is partly because of a lack of written records.
Alors moi, j'ai fait un gros article là-dessus il y a très très longtemps. Ça s'est passé le 15 décembre 1914. Il faut savoir qu'en 1914, des fusillés pour l'exemple et des décimations, on vous compte 1, 2, 3, on en prend 10, 20, 30, 40. Moi, j'en ai compté 3. Celui dont vous parlez, d'Elbik, c'est pas le seul. Il y en a eu 3. Un qui a touché des spahis, c'est-à-dire des zouaves, pardon, c'est-à-dire des juifs algériens. Un autre des tirailleurs tunisiens et le troisième des tirailleurs algériens. Mais moi, c'est ici que, là derrière vous, que j'ai vu les statistiques. C'était marqué sur du papier, si vous voulez. Or, l'incident d'Elbik dont vous parlez, c'est le général commandant le corps qui avait commandé ça, et ça a été approuvé par le général Foch, et qui dit, oui, vous avez raison, ils seront tués le 15 décembre comme ça. Bien. Alors, ceci dit, des décimations, il y en a eu d'autres. Hein. Seulement, le problème pour l'historien, c'est que vous apercevez qu'à partir de 1915, vous n'en avez plus de traces. Or, mon raisonnement historien est le suivant. En 1914, tout se fait par écrit. Il n'y a pas de téléphone. Si bien que si vous allez dans le sous-sol de ces archives, vous vous rendez compte que les archives d'une division, comme division algérienne, la 37e ou la 38e ou la 45e, c'est 5 mètres de carton en longueur. En 1915, c'est comme ça. En 1918, c'est comme ça. Mais je pense que s'il y en a eu qu'on ne connaît pas, c'est que les ordres ont été transmis par téléphone et qu'elles n'ont pas laissé de traces par écrit.
As a footnote, Meunier cites the decimation of a French division for mutiny in 1917 as evidence that it continued during the war. World War I saw a new, deadly threat to the Allies on the Western Front, including North African troops. Ypres, in the Belgian province of West Flanders, was the scene of 5 major battles in 4 years. In the second, in April and May 1915, the Germans used chlorine gas against the Entente powers for the first time. Algerians and Moroccans fought alongside British, French and Canadians. gas from over 5,000 canisters blew towards them. 6,000 men died and many others were blinded. The Second Battle of Ypres heralded a new era of industrial-scale warfare.
The first attack involved the 45th Algerian Division and the 87th French Territorial Division. Those were the two units first exposed. But of course they fled to other parts of the front. Subsequent gas attacks, and there were a number in April, afflicted Canadian forces and British forces as well as French. Several of the Allied formations were exposed to gas fairly early on.
Armies have always used technology to develop new methods of warfare. But World War I saw a step change in the level of collaboration between scientists and the military. When the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry opened in the Berlin suburb of Dahlem in October 1912, its first director was Fritz Haber. Its scientists have since won 33 Nobel Prizes, but Haber is infamous for having invented chemical warfare because of his development of poisonous gas in the war. Haber himself won a Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1918 for his synthesizing of ammonia. Much food production depends today on Haber's method for producing fertilizer. But the impact of the chemical weaponry developed from Haber's chlorine gas has been devastating. Tunisians were first conscripted into the French army in 1911. They found themselves fighting as part of a French occupying force in Morocco in March 1912. Then they were called on to fight fellow Muslims on a far greater scale. When the Ottomans joined the war in November 1914, it dawned on the Tunisian conscripts they might now be ordered to fight Turks, Syrians, Iraqis, Lebanese, and Palestinians. This deeply offended their Arab sensibilities. And this apprehension quickly turned to insubordination. Here at the Tunisian port of Bizerte, there was a rebellion in November 1914 by troops being sent by the French to Europe. The Tunisians refused to board boats bound for Marseille.
في شهر نوفمبر 30 من نوفمبر بالضبط عندما رفض هؤلاء الجنود الصعود إلى الباخرة والذهاب إلى جبهات القتال. مرد ذلك أساساً كما قلنا تنامي هذا الحس الديني وهذا الشعور، في حين أن حتى التقارير العسكرية الفرنسية تنفي هذا الشعور الديني، ونحن نستغرب يعني كما تعلمون هناك يعني تعتيم حتى عسكري لئلا يتطور هذا الشعور ويصبح تقريبا هو السمة الطاغية، وحتى هذا الرفض سيعلل فيما بعد بأننا سنحارب مسلمين مثلنا، وهذا ما لعبت عليه كثيرا الدعاية العثمانية آنذاك من خلال ليبيا بالطبع، وكذلك حتى الدعاية الألمانية. ألمانيا كانت تقول نحن مع المسلمين ضد هؤلاء الذين يريدون الحرب ويريدون بالطبع يعني بعث أو إرسال هؤلاء الجنود للقتال من أجل فرنسا أو من أجل إنجلترا، فبالتالي كانت تسوق الدعاية الألمانية والعثمانية بعبثية هذا الحرب وعدم جدواه.
إذن ما حدث آنذاك عشرات من الجنود التونسيين رفضوا الصعود على متن الباخر التي كانت متجهة إلى مرسيليا، ومن هناك كانت سيرسلون إلى جبهات القتال. ماذا حدث عندما رفضوا الصعود على متن الباخرة؟ ماذا كان رد فعل الضباط العسكريين الفرنسيين؟
فعلا نجد إشارات خلال الأرشيف العسكري الفرنسي إلى هذا الرفض يعني للصعود على، ولكن وقع تعتيم لمعرفة هل أن هذا الصعود يعني ما هي أسبابه، ولكن لم يتم ذكر كيف وقع وقف هذا الحادث وكيف تمت مجابهته. قال أن هناك ما يقارب ما بين 100 إلى 150 جنديا قتلوا لكي يكونوا عبرة للآخرين على أن لا يعصوا الأوامر العسكرية. تم تعتيمه عليه يعني بصورة كبيرة جدا حتى لا ينتشر الخبر داخل تونس وأن لا ينعكس على الجزائر والمغرب، مما سيحفز العديد من الجنود الذين سيتم إرسالهم إلى الجبهات إلى الاقتداء بهؤلاء والعصيان. وإذا كان العصيان عاما في تونس والجزائر والمغرب فبالتالي فرنسا ستواجه خطر كبير ولن تقدر على إرسال الجنود إلى الجبهات.
The German and Ottoman campaign to unsettle Muslims around the issue of fighting other Muslims clearly caused unrest in the Arab world, but its effects were also felt in other colonies, including India. In January 1915, an Indian regiment in Singapore rebelled because they thought the British were sending them to fight the Ottomans.
You have a number of reports of Indian Muslim soldiers being quite unhappy about being sent to fight the Khalifa, really, being sent to fight the Ottoman Empire. There's one instance of an entire battalion refusing to board their ship to go, but peaceably. The most dramatic thing, and what must have been terrifying to the English and very frightening, is that in Singapore, the 5th Light Infantry, which is composed of Muslims, actually open fire on the English officers and soldiers, and something like 80 plus, they kill 80 plus Englishmen. And the reprisals are very harsh, and they're arrested, rounded up, and that must have really scared the English officers in command, because the idea that, when you have hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers, if that kind of thing takes off, it's going to be a big problem. So where there are mutinies, they're really put down harshly. But it's not only the Muslims, because what's happening in India is you also have Indian nationalists of all religions who want the British to go.
Coming up, opposition to conscription and French colonial occupation fuels more unrest in Tunisia. Malek meets more descendants of North African war veterans and hears their personal stories. And how Arab troops contributed to one of the Allies' most serious defeats of the war at Gallipoli.
Then Mustafa Kemal, as the reserves are coming up, issued his order. I do not order you to fight, I order you to die.
The Tunisian writer and broadcaster Malek Tariki is on a personal journey exploring the role played by Arabs in the First World War. Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians and Egyptians fought on one side for the British and French. And troops from the Levant fought for the Ottomans on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. No Muslim wanted to fight against fellow Muslim. And in the French colonies, opposition to conscription and imperial occupation grew. There were two uprisings, in 1915 and 16, near the southeastern Tunisian town of Gabis on the Libyan border. Dissidents fighting the French joined other rebels under Khalifa bin Askar, himself resisting the Libyans. Two battles took place in which hundreds of French soldiers were killed. The rebels who fought the French, like Mohammed al-Daghbagji, wrote themselves into Tunisian folklore. He survived to fight the French many more times, but was finally hanged by them in 1924. But despite regional resistance and rebellion, the majority of North Africans conscripted into the French army ultimately had no choice but to follow orders and fight. One such man was Mohammed bin Misbah. He had two daughters, Tawus and Munia. Tawus later married a man called Lassar Shaiti, who went on to fight the French occupation and the Jews in Palestine. Their father, Mohammed, however, was decorated with the Médaille Militaire and the French Military Cross.
هو صغير وما عندهم باش نقولوا احنا خاطر دولة مستعمرة.
اي صحيح.
اجباري باش تهزهم. هزتهم معناتها بالسيف اجباري عليهم بالقوة. إذا خاطر من تلقاه نفسه باش واحد باش يمشي باش يستشهد في بقعة أخرى وكما نقولوا يحارب على ما غير بلاده ولا على غير ضربوا بلاده ما نظنش. أما هما هزوهم بالقوة وقتها.
ما عندهمش خيار.
ما عندهمش حتى خيار. أي ما عندهم حتى خيار هزوهم. وبعد هو عمل حاجة باهية في تونس اللي هو ولد عمه رجل أختي لازار شرايتي ناظر كان قائد ثورة تونسية وهو زاد عاونهم معناتها
كان واقف
معاهم معناتها كان يظهر
اي وطني على
بلاده عاون.
وهذه طبعا وهذه اخر تصويره للوالد الله يرحمه اللي توفى عام 72 هيك ملامح تونسيه اصيله
The father of Tunisian writer Jalloul Azouna was conscripted into the French army in 1916. Jalloul saved valuable wartime papers, including some belonging to his father's friend, Mansour Albian. They not only offer an insight into Mansour's time as a prisoner of war, but also of visits paid to him by the leaders of a nationalist youth movement, the Young Tunisians, pioneers in the struggle for independence.
هذايا السيد هذا اسمه منصور بن محمد بن أحمد بن علي بن مبروك الباي، منصور الباي. هذا توفي سنة 76 وبقي 7 سنوات أسير وظن والده أنه مات ووقعت تعزيته فيه إلى آخره. وكان ممن زارهم مرات المناضل التونسي الكبير المرحوم علي باش حامبة الذي كان لاجئا في تركيا وكان يحمل لهم بعض الوثائق.
كان لاجئا للتعريف بالقضية التونسية
والدفاع عنها وكان يأتي لهذايا المعسكرات الأسرى في الحرب ليرفع من معنوياتهم ويفتح لهم الآفاق. وكان من جملة ما يقول لهم كان يجيب لهم شوية أدعية وهذوما بعض أوراق 4 أوراق مخطوطة فيها أدعية وهي كلها تدعو إلى الإيمان بالله وإلى الإيمان بالقضاء والقدر وإلى الصدق في هذا الإيمان لأنه هذا يأتي بالمعجزات وعزاء كبير إلى آخره. فكان يرفع من معنوياته وكان يقول لهم راهو سيأتي يوم سيقع تحريركم وسيأتي يوم ستستقل فيه تونس وبربي قل لهم ما يغركمش مشيش تلقوا ظروف متاع إقامة هنا في رومانيا ولا في تركيا ولا في ألمانيا ولا في بلاصة ولا في فرنسا ولا في غيرها وتعجبكم بنات تتزوجون منهم ولابد أن ترجعوا لتونس وتتجوزوا تونسيات لأن تونس ستستقل يوما ما بفضل تجربتكم انتم اللي عشتها في الحرب بفضل خبرتكم إلى آخره.
Jalloul is unusual in having kept his father's memorabilia. Few Arab families still have personal records of their ancestors' war experiences. There are records at a small military museum in Nafida in central Tunisia. Here, Malik came across a man doing family research. In an old suitcase, they found French military records showing that the man's grandfather, Ali bin Haj Amour al-Akrami, fought with the Allies on the Western Front.
هذا بول والد نموش بول والد أنا هو ما كنتش تعرف أنه موجود ما كنتش تعرف أنها موجودة في الأوراق. أنا وثائق غير مؤرشفة في الأرشيف الرسمي هذه موجودة في المتحف هذا.
طبعا وفيه فيه المعطيات عنه كلها. قبل ذلك فيه المعطيات أنه هو في أي عام مولود عام 95 وأنه هو شارك في الحرب كاملة من عام 14 لعام 18، وكان طبعا في الصوم المنطقة الفرنسية، يعني في الجبهة الغربية.
كان تحكي لي أمي عليه.
وأصيب في كتفه، أصيب في
هو عام 76.
عام 76.
عام 76.
هو من عام 45 فيه بيان بالإعانات التي كانت السلطات الفرنسية تقدمها للقدام المحاربين. هنا مثلا تذكر أنه في البداية كان حصول على ثياب، أكثرها ثياب وقماش. هنا يذكر حتى أنه قدم له إعانة عام 46، هذا لتجهيز ابنته للزفاف، لعرس ابنته. خالتك يعني هذا
خالتي الكبيرة.
يعني توثيق عائلي.
الله
يرحمهم جميعا.
But the Western Front was not the only theatre of war. With stalemate in Europe, in April 1915, Britain's Navy chief, Winston Churchill, hatched a plot against Germany's Ottoman ally. He wanted to take Istanbul and open a sea route to Russia. The Ottomans appeared weakened by a series of defeats. The Russian Tsar Nicholas I had even called them the sick man of Europe. They'd failed to prevent an Italian landing in Libya in 1911 and lost most of their territories in the Balkans by 1913. Enter an Ottoman army officer, Mustafa Kemal. He would later go on to be the first president of Turkey. But in 1915, he achieved the kind of victory War Minister Anwar Pasha had failed to deliver in Libya or the Balkans. And he did it here, in a bitter 7 months of fighting, not just with his own troops, but, we now know, with the vital support of 300,000 Arabs. The battle was Gallipoli. When ships landed Allied troops here on the 25th of April 1915, only a small unit of Ottoman soldiers protected the coast with rapidly diminishing ammunition. Mustafa Kemal hoped they might hold out until reinforcements arrived, and gave his now famous order, which must have struck terror into their hearts.
It was here, down coming through here, that Mustafa Kemal, leading the first of the Ottoman reserves into the battle, came across the Turkish soldiers, the survivors of the outpost battle above the beaches, retreating up this way. And he told them first to stop, and they said, the enemy. They were only a few hundred metres away. Then he told them to stay here. They said, we have no ammunition. And then he told them to fix their bayonets and lie down. And in fact, the Australians were stopped. They thought that there was a strong Turkish line in front of them, and they stopped advancing as well. They also lay down. But then Mustafa Kemal, as the reserves are coming up, issued his order that I do not order you to fight, I order you to die. He gave this order saying that other reserves would come up. They, while buying time with the lives of these soldiers, would give time for the rest of the forces to come up here and to contain the invasion. So most of the men he was with, they did die, but they did fight as well.
So he literally meant that because they had no ammunition.
There was no ammunition. The ammunition did come up, but they formed here, they fought. The battle swayed backwards and forwards as one side then the other got more men. But the casualties here were horrendous in that first day. Very few men who came into this fight came out of it alive. Most of the Australians and New Zealanders, their bodies were found here 4 years later. But in the time that those Ottoman soldiers fought and died here, the reserves came up, the door was bolted.
Soldiers' diaries now tell us that Kemal's 19th Army was largely Arab. Up to 2/3 of the men fighting for him in the Gallipoli campaign were from Greater Syria, present-day Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Palestine.
Mustafa Kemal commanded on that first day, 25th of April, all of the troops in this area. And his personal division of 3 regiments, there was only 1 Turkish regiment, the others were the 72nd, 77th Arab regiments. There was another Turkish regiment also serving here. They joined together to fight, to hem in the vastly superior numbers of Allied troops held until reinforcements arrived. But yes, Mustafa Kemal needed and relied on those Arab troops. They may have been written out of some of the history in later years as part of the founding myth of the Turkish Republic that grew from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. And yet, those Arab soldiers stood here, they fought and they died.
This is the hill from where Mustafa Kemal commanded his troops, his Ottoman troops, which included many Arab soldiers, and led them to victory against the most powerful forces of the age, the British and French empires. This victory started the rise to fame of Mustafa Kemal, first as military hero, then as a national leader for modern Turkey. Generations of Arab school children learned the poem by Ahmad Shawqi in which he likens Mustafa Kemal to Khalid ibn al-Walid, the famous Muslim military leader and companion of the Prophet Muhammad. In this poem he says, Allahu Akbaru, kam fil fathi min ajabi, يا خالد التركي جدد خالد العربي صلح عزيز على حرب مظفرة فالسيف في غمده والحق في النصب.
The Arab dead of both sides were buried in cemeteries across Europe, Turkey, and the Balkans, and prisoners of war transported to POW camps. The Germans sometimes separated Muslims from other prisoners so they could try and undermine their loyalty to France and Britain. They put North Africans together in one camp and Tartar soldiers who'd fought for Russia at another.
The first transport of French prisoners of war, including North African prisoners of war, was in autumn 1914, and they were sent to Zossen and other places, but they were together, the French ones and the North Africans. And then there was this idea and the suggestion to separate Muslim prisoners from other prisoners. And the idea behind this was to have better chances for propaganda purposes. And that's why there was this suggestion to build one camp which was exclusively for Muslim prisoners of war. At the end, they separated the prisoners, and there was one prisoner of war camp in Zossen, which was called the Weinberg Lager, where there were Tatarian, Caucasian prisoners, soldiers who belonged to the Russian army. Also Muslims, but not exclusively Muslims. And the others were sent to the Half Moon camp, which was opened in the beginning of 1915. And this camp was meant for North African prisoners of war, but also for Indian prisoners of war. And they also had a small group of Korean and Vietnamese prisoners at the Half Moon camp.
The first mosque to be erected on German soil was erected here at the Half Moon POW camp, a large ornate wooden structure completed in July 1915. Half Moon was a show camp in which the Kaiser and German hierarchy took a strong interest. It was a key part of their campaign to turn Muslim troops against their European masters, dating back to the Grand Mufti's call to jihad in November 1914. They used the comforts of the Half Moon POW camp to woo the 3,000 to 4,000 Muslim inmates and turn them against the Allies who'd conscripted them. It's been called the Jihad experiment.
It was built in the beginning of the First World War. I think in the end of 1914, early 1915, and it was paid from the private purse of William II, the German Kaiser. It was also a type of a propaganda action. There were about 400, 500 Muslims living in Berlin. And they used, after the war, this mosque again as their mosque. They came from Berlin here at Friday and especially during Ramadan. Later they built their own mosque in Berlin, and then this building was made by wood. It was not a concrete or something like that, a very strong building. And I think in the late 1920s it collapsed because nobody took care of it.
The Muslim prisoners at Half Moon certainly enjoyed better facilities than other camps offered. The Half Moon project was led by the German lawyer, diplomat, ancient historian and archaeologist Max von Oppenheim. He invited prominent Arab academics and spiritual leaders to come and visit the prisoners at Half Moon.
There were activities. They did some sports, and it was somehow part of the entertainment. There were coming important Arab nationalists like the Egyptian Mohammed Farid or the Tunisian Saleh Asharif al-Tunisi, who made propaganda for their ideas of an independent Egypt or an independent Tunis. And there was also the very famous person of literature and of politics, the Syrian Shakib Aslan, who, for example, toured Germany and came here. When he came to Cologne, he met the mayor, who happened to be the later Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. This was also a part of, you see, the daily life of them.
But the jihad campaign was ultimately unsuccessful. Some prisoners of war did later fight for the Germans, but with little commitment. The Half Moon POW camp, however, has rarely appeared in mainstream European accounts of the war. In the German town of Zossen, near the prison camp, Malek discovered academics of the time had created some priceless sound archives. Having Arabs from different countries and backgrounds in the camps gave linguists the chance to compile valuable oral history. They captured the voices of ordinary North Africans for the very first time. The Arab soldier would no longer be a forgotten name in dusty archives. He could tell his own story, and though the words are indistinct, his voice be heard by future generations. Many of these troops were illiterate, but Malek discovered a recording of a Moroccan POW singing a 10th century poem. The poet himself was a prisoner of the Byzantines, and his verse is about defiance, something close to the heart of the Moroccan prisoner of war in Germany in 1915. In the next episode, the Ottoman story of the war, the rise of the Young Turks and their alliance with Germany. Ottoman tyranny in Greater Syria and the suffering of the Arab people. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, and his courtship of the Ottomans before changing sides. And far from being simply a European affair, the way the war gave birth to three nationalist movements: Turkish, Zionist, and Arab. In the next episode of World War I Through Arab Eyes.